Hi, how's it going? This is the new release schedule with updated information on it. So 110.10 is being prepared right now. That will go out in a couple of days. Just preparing the newsletter and things like that. We're done with the binary changes. 112.3, the end of the 112 line, will probably happen at the end of May. We have another release of 114.1, of 114 coming out. 114.1 will be at the end of April. And that's mainly for we're bringing over some more ECP features and bug fixes and things like that. And then we're thinking of doing another release at the end of August. So again, to get ECP features out for that project, exascale computing project, people who don't know what ECP is. So that's the HDF 5 release schedule. And I have not put a release schedule on HDF View yet. One of the things I want to do, if you look at the HDF View site, let's see here, HDF View, take a peek here, right? This is ugly and has no README like everything else does, and so I'll add that in the process of getting that set up. But this is the HDF View release schedule. Before we had other releases, there was that were based on 110 and 112, and so we retired those. The only ones that we're going to have going forward are the ones that are based on 114.0 and HDF 4.42.16. So so we've got one that's being prepared now that'll come out probably another week or two, and then we have another. We'll probably do another release next year. This is mainly driven by the cadence at which we release HDF 4, right? So because we're not going to have another major release of HDF 5 for several years. Let's talk about VFD SWMR. So this is the latest RFC. I'm not going to go through this very carefully. I just want to, especially since John's here, I just want to talk about the history of this feature and getting it into the library and what we think we might be able to do in the future. And I will briefly mention what is VFD SWMR. So the existing implementation of SWMR that is in the library is based on the idea of flush dependencies. It's the idea is that if you have two things that are written on the disk that refer to each other, you want to write the child first before the parent, so that a reader that comes along will always see a coherent file, right? So if you were to write the parent first and then the child does not get written to the disk because it's sitting in a cache somewhere inside the HDF5 library, if a reader comes along and tries to read that and resolve that dependency, it's going to read trash off of the file. It'll say like, oh, there's a btree node here, but there's no btree node there because it's still in the writer's cache. So this was implemented back in 110.0, which is many years ago, and it only works for dataset appends, and it does not work for variable length types. So you're kind of limited in what you can do. You have to set up all your data sets and get them and create your groups and things like that, and then essentially start the SWMR writes. And we have an API call to do that, or you can close and open the file. But so it's kind of limited in what you can do. And we've always wanted to have full SWMR. And there was some efforts under, I think, one of the exascale computing projects to try and bring full SWMR over, and it still hasn't gotten there yet. There's a lot of sharp edges under the hood to make this all work out. So instead, there's this alternative version that we created called VFD SWMR that uses basically checkpoint files and some ticks internally to decide when we're going to update checkpoint files and things like that. And so so this is it's a different structure. This is also, it can be used on potentially on NFS, which the existing SWMR cannot, because we cannot guarantee write ordering on network file systems. So it extends to everything. It extends to well, pretty much everything in the HDF5 library. So you can use it in a much wider variety of circumstances. And so this is a feature that a lot of people wanted for a long time, because many workflows are like this, where you have a writer that is scribbling out data that it's producing or consuming from some place, and you want downstream clients to be able to monitor this HDF5 file as it grows and develops. Like a scientific data flows. Like if you one of the original uses for SWMR is for at the synchrotron light sources, is that you want to be able to monitor the data that you're getting, because you want to make sure that you're using your very valuable beam time effectively. And so if you're not getting a diffraction pattern, then just, maybe you have a salt crystal instead of a protein crystal, so you want to stop. So the history of this feature. So I was not on this project early, so I did not have anything to do with the early development of it. It was developed under Acadio, which was kind of a sister company of the HDF Group. I was brought in at the end, where I was just kind of cleaning up some of the loose ends before release. But my impression of this is that it changed hands multiple times. It did, I think, always have John as the captain, but the actual person who did a lot of coding work changed over time. And so some of the code internally is not consistent, is not always hewed to our normal library coding standards. There are a lot of things that we had to kind of clean up in the last year of this project. When I first came onto this project, it wouldn't even compile on Linux. Like, that's how awkward the code was. So we fixed a lot of stuff through kind of a heroic, last year-ish effort to get all this stuff out. John did a lot of reviewing and updating code. We moved a bunch of stuff around, but I felt that, and the reason that this didn't go in, it was scheduled to go into 1.14.0. I think we initially had it pegged at 1.13.2 or 3. And the reason that it didn't go in was it felt rushed. That it's a big feature. It touches a bunch of stuff inside the library. It's not just the VFD. If it were just the VFD, the way that subfiling is just the VFD and kind of sits off by itself, I would be totally fine merging it in. But it doesn't. It touches kind of a lot of things in the library. And so I did feel that was rushed, and that was not quite ready for prime time. In code review, there were a lot of things that were identified, many of which were admittedly there were things that potentially could have been fixed, because some of it is just it's cosmetic. It's adding error checking here and making this look more like library code here. Some of it was a little more structural, but I felt like we did need to have a bigger discussion about the code and what it was doing before it went into the library. And there just wasn't enough time with all the other features that we had to get into the library. Now, I would like to get this in. This is a priority for me. I do want to get this in. The problem is that now there are no resources to work on this inside our company right now. Not a lot anyway. And I feel like this is going to require some attention before it gets merged into the library. And so that's my problem right now, is that I don't have any people to put on something that is currently not funded. So that's the challenge. So what's the plan going forward? I don't know. I've started to sit down and plan out the kind of the sustaining engineering work that we'll be doing over the next year or so. And there's some bits in here that I think that we can pull over independently, like potentially some of John had reworked the page buffering layer. And so that's a thing that I think I can probably go through there and kind of scissor out some of the stuff that's in there just for VFD SWMR, because you have to be careful, I think, about torn pages. But that might be able to go over into the library, and then we can get some of the stuff in there. And that's code that I think is more mature, right? That many of the areas that are a little quirkier are outside of some of that core stuff that like John or Valen worked on. So yeah, so that's, and I feel like before we bring this in, there does need to be, we didn't really do a lot of performance testing. There's still issues with the test. The tests don't run on Windows. So this is not checked at all on Windows. Because they use fork and exec, and then they use named pipes to communicate. The tests run very slowly. So that's another issue that we need to think about, is that this is essentially going to double the testing time of running the library tests, which has implications. So yeah, so that's where we are. And I'm not sure exactly how this is going to go over the next like 6 months or a year. It'd be great if we could get it in 1.14.2, which I plan to, as I mentioned earlier, release in the fall. But I don't have the resources internally to do that unless somebody comes up with money. So or wants to do a whole bunch of deep diving outside of the company. And then even then, if this were done outside of the company as a community project, I still need people inside the company to come in to basically coordinate and ensure and code review and things like that. This is a non-trivial feature. This isn't just like somebody went in and fixed some minor bugs. This is somebody would have to go in and do some heavy lifting on a major feature. So that's the challenge. So I don't have a lot of answers now. There's a lot of discussion recently, and so I did want to bring this up as something that we should talk about, especially since John's here. But I don't have an easy plan going forward to get this in the library. Thoughts? What do you think, John?
I will make one technical comment.
Sure.
You bring in the revised or rewritten, more correctly, page buffer. I'd suggest you bring the whole thing in. It's set up to work either with regular HDF5 or VFD SWMR, and if you try and tease it apart, you're going to spend a lot of time and then just go undo it when the time comes. So I would suggest you bring the entire thing in. Small correction. Right now, while there's a lot of work towards supporting VFD SWMR over NFS, it's not really there yet. The testing hasn't been completed.
Yeah, it's just it could work over it. The other SWMR version will not.
Yep. So those are technical comments that jumped out at me as I was listening to you.
But like Elena had mentioned that this is something that, like, we could get together with the community and do it. Like, so at Lifeboat, like, what sort of resources do you guys have to bring to bear on this?
We were certainly hoping to get some resources to build on VFD SWMR. That's still very much up in the air. Certainly, if we had those resources, we would be very interested in helping. Right now, I'm kind of swamped. I have to work on the multi-thread, and it looks like we are going to be doing something on adding support for sparse data, and possibly, while we're at it, reworking variable length data as well, because they're very similar problems.
Right.
So certainly until we have some more staff, there's only one of me, and I can do only so much in between loading trailers. Although thankfully that's about done.
Yeah, I feel like that's the same kind of problem that we have. That we have a lot of things going on, and so it's very difficult to find time to work on this. Even though, I mean, it's a useful feature that I think a lot of people would find useful. But
more than that, it will simplify your maintenance overhead going forward, because it pretty much disassociates SWMR from the rest of the library.
Yeah, but then the problem is what do we do with the old version of SWMR? Right?
Well, that's the fun part. And yeah, since it's not documented, even identifying the relevant code can be a bit entertaining. So there's going to be a long, slow process of slowly disassembling that and removing it, assuming that's what you want to do.
Right. I mean, do we leave both of them in? Do we remove one? I mean, that's kind of a big remove, right? That people might be upset about.
I wouldn't think so. You said there hadn't been much performance testing. We actually did a fair bit of it. It just didn't get written up. And performance results, unless you're doing huge numbers of data sets and making lots and lots of updates and extensions to them, are really quite good. In some cases, though it was hard to believe at the time, marginally faster than straight FDF5 without SWMR. That's the case where you have a few very large data sets. And I think what that was is just a whole bunch of metadata wasn't being written out by the HDF5 library and was instead being boxed up in pages and written out efficiently to the metadata file. So yeah, we did a fair bit of performance work. It's just limited amount of time to write it up. I think the test code to run those performance tests are still around. I should remember who did it. It'll come to me, but
Kent, was it Kent that did it?
no, Kent didn't do it. No, Kent did some of it. Kent did the performance work, certainly on groups. He might have done data sets as well. I'm sorry, it's been a while, and I was kind of busy with other matters at the time this was going on.
Well, I think in terms of like the tasks that would have to be done is, one, there needs to be basically like, there's going to have to be like a big review of where we are.
Well, that's your call.
Then there's, but I mean, just being an assessment, right? And so that takes time. And then, what else is there? So there's going to be like code quality issues.
That I can't speak to. I haven't been involved in the review and integration process at all. The little time that I had to work on this at the beginning of 2022 was cleaning up some errors in some implementation work, which had been done by another developer.
Right. So some code quality issues. There might be some structural issues.
Not that I'm aware of. And if you do run into them, I would expect them to be in a few small corners. For example, there was a bit of work done in one flavor of data set to get VFD SWMR to work properly. That would be worth reviewing. Violin did that. Excuse me?
The VDS stuff?
No, I don't think so. I think it was, I forget which of the data sets. Again, forgive me, this is from memory and it was quite a while ago. But in general, my impression was that you wouldn't see much in the way of structural problems because the whole idea was to move SWMR below the level of most of the library code.
Right. So let's say I'll say structural issues with a question mark. Then we have code quality issues, structural issues. When there's definitely Windows deficiencies.
Yeah, you have that with the existing SWMR, however.
Yes.
So,
not so much anymore, right?
Really?
We converted those tests to PowerShell.
Okay, good for you.
Yeah. The problem that we have with the Windows tests on a VFD SWMR is that the VFD SWMR tests use a bunch of constructs that do not have easy Windows equivalents. I mean, the stuff with the name pipes was not particularly difficult because the way that Windows name pipes works is pretty close. But there is also I remember there's a bunch of stuff where they wouldn't even compile. Right. So even though I think rewriting the VFD SWMR test in PowerShell is going to be a pretty straightforward application of what we did to the SWMR test, there's a bunch of stuff in there that uses a lot of POSIX systems that do not have easy Windows equivalents.
Well, also remember when you're working on those tests, if you're going to do proper NFS tests, you're going to need to convert some of that name pipe stuff over to use sockets or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Have to be working cross systems.
That's sort of just kind of over and above just the basic fundamentals, but convert to sockets. So yeah, so then there's that. Then there'd probably be final round.
But again, this is stuff for adding in the Windows support and the NFS support, and the NFS testing still has to get done. I would certainly think that just getting it into the library so you don't have to deal with the development branch continuing to fall further and further behind.
Yes, but I feel like historically what has happened when we agree to do that is that the Windows stuff never gets fixed.
Yeah, well,
Windows
is the
has always
perfect
been
the
like
enemy
less
of the good is what it comes down to. And well, that's your decision these days, you and Neil.
yeah. So yeah, and then address the long running tests, which I think that's kind of a pain, right? Like that the VFD swimmer tests take a very, very, very long time to run.
Quite true. Again, they don't have to be run all the time. So you will decide what you want to do with that. And we have similar issues with some of the multi-thread support where the tests take forever and a day, appropriately so, but you don't run them all the time.
Right. I feel that way with the legacy swimmer stuff too. That some of these things need to be converted to a separate suite of tests that are not necessarily run every time you run make check.
If somebody doesn't want swimmer, there's no particular reason for them to run the tests. We have to run them, of course, but only when we're building with swimmer.
Well, I feel like the things like the swimmer test and the multi-threaded test should really be test suites that can be started and stopped kind of arbitrarily so that they can run arbitrarily long.
Mm-hmm.
If you really want to convince yourself that swimmer is a thing that works, you could just fire up something that just sat in a corner and just ran for like 24 hours and just see what happens as it creates a whole bunch of files and scribble stuff into them.
You could play with that. I think there is some ability to configure the size of the tests when you kick it off. I don't think right now they're set up to run arbitrarily long, because normally what's happening is changing the number and sizes of data sets and the size of the reads and writes.
There's a couple of obvious large tasks that would have to be performed before VFD Swimmer can be moved over. So the next question is does anyone know where we can get funding? Right, funding makes this happen, right? Otherwise, it's going to happen very slowly because we're just not going to have resources. Nobody's going to have resources.
Well, as I said, we're working on it. Didn't get it last time round. It's certainly not off our radar.
You applied for VFD Swimmer funding?
Oh yeah.
Oh.
It was one of a bunch of applications. Of course, we got the hardest one. The VFD swimmer one would have been trivial. I was sort of hoping for that, but no, also lots more work for me.
Because that's the grease that makes the wheels turn, right? Is if there's money and resources available, then it's easy to put people on this project and make it move forward.
No arguments. Although, again, keep in mind that my primary objective when I was developing VFD Swimmer was to minimize the maintenance overhead. So there's certainly an argument for trying to do it somehow, because otherwise you have to maintain existing swimmer and
But we have to do that anyway. I mean, I don't have any realistic plans for removing legacy swimmer from the library. I mean, that would require a lot of work to do, and I can think of better things to do with that money than maintain. I mean, and also too, then anybody who depends on that is going to be upset with us. I mean, people get upset with us when we change command line arguments in the tools, right? Like people are going to get really upset if I remove like the existing swimmer calls and they have to update their software.
You have pretty much a more capable drop-in replacement. Removing support for existing swimmer is fairly straightforward. The code that supports it is going to be additional overhead in the library, and that's going to be a long slog to get rid of. But deciding to no longer support it is fairly straightforward, although obviously you want to have one release with both to give people time to switch over.
But that's also, that's a major, well, it could be released in 114, and so you'd have 114 that had both, and then an HDF 5 2.0, you could actually remove the existing swimmer.
At least remove the APIs, and then slowly, as you do other maintenance, spot that stuff and remove it. Some of the difficulties you have is that some of the support code for the original version of Swimmer has now been reused in other places, particularly the flush dependencies in the metadata cache, which complicate the metadata cache horribly and make it harder to maintain. And you're going to have to decide how much of that you're going to keep. But as for the actual cache clients themselves, once they stop caring about supporting existing Swimmer, they can be slowly simplified.
Well, I wish I had great answers for people about, when VFD Swimmer is going to be appearing. But the only thing that I can promise is that I will try to, over the next month or so, take a look at the existing state of the code and see how bad it is to get it all in sync. But I'm already overworked, so I don't have a whole lot of spare cycles to throw at this. So it's going to be difficult to promise anything over the next, like for 114.2. I'd be thrilled to say that we're going to put it in 114.2. I can't guarantee anything.
Okay, I would make it one more comment about the re-implemented page buffer. One of the arguments for not putting in features which are not currently used is concern about bit rot and such. However, at least for significant sections of the VFD Swimmer specific capabilities, I believe there's test code for those. Not all of it, sadly. That was on my to-do, but resources had to go elsewhere. But it won't be sitting there completely untested.
Yes. Anything else? They may have any questions about HDF 5 in general, about the releases, about what's coming up. Too bad Elaine is not here. I'm sure she would have a bazillion opinions about all of
yeah, but she's in flight at present, I believe, which is why she asked me to appear.
But she and I should probably chat, especially if you guys are looking to secure funding for potentially working on VFD Swimmer and bringing it up to speed.
It is certainly on our to-do. As always, it's the funding issue.
Right.
But we will see what we can do. And I'll leave it at that. Elaine has a better feeling of what's going on with that than I do. I just know something's going on because I've been supporting some proposals and such.
Yeah, I know that there's definitely communities that are interested in this, but are they willing to get together and throw some resources into the problem? I don't know.
Yeah. Slack guys threw a whole bunch of funding at us, so it's rather unfortunate to leave them out to dry.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's all I have today. I think if we have anything else that's going on.
well, I'm done as well. So
One of the things that I could mention is that, so if anybody's been keeping an eye on the issues that we have in HDF5, what tends to happen sometimes is that people run a fuzzer over the HDF5 library code and what the files that we import, and we'll wind up with a bunch of fresh new issues. Sometimes CVE issues, sometimes people just bring them up to us. But sometimes you wind up with seg faults, sometimes you can wind up with aborts in debug code. You can wind up with memory leaks and core cleanup. And so one of the things that I've started the process of doing is going through the code and cleaning up all the places where we have problems with this. So as these issues come in, we not only fix them, but we're systematically going through and starting to clean up some of the file parsing code so that we don't have these issues in the future. And it's going to take a little while. Again, this is something that we don't have an enormous amount of funding for, and just people for, really. But as these things come in, my plan is to fix them much more comprehensively than we have in the past. In the past, we've often just kind of, somebody raised a CVE issue because we divide by 0 in some decode or deserialized function, and we fix that and then we move along. And so now going forward, I'm trying to, when we find these issues, fix them comprehensively so that the whole function is now cleaned up. And also too, we're creating a list of places where we need to go through and do this work. And we'll systematically go through the entire library and do this. And I've also asked one of our developers to also give me a list of all the CVE issues and when the fix dates were. And so we'll add that into the repository. So you have some one-stop shopping to see when we fixed any CVE issues that have been filed against the HDF5 library. So that's something that's coming. It won't be in 114.1 because that's too soon. We're 114.1, there's only a few more weeks left. But 114.2 should have most of this work in it, if not all of it. So, and that would be very nice because that's one of the things that drives me bananas is when suddenly I have a dozen fresh new issues that I have to go dig into. So hopefully this will nip that in the bud.
have you identified any file format changes or extensions necessary to address these sorts of issues?
No, the problem is that most of this stuff is in the very old versions of the file format that kind of predate checksums.
Mm-hmm.
So version 1B trees and things like that. A lot of the object header messages, all that stuff is not checksummed at all. And so so fuzzers will just flip the bits in some files, and then we have problems. So there's not a whole lot we can do about it. We can harden that layer, but there's not much we can do. I've thought about creating a configure option that would allow you to only use checksum metadata, but you have to go through and create checksum versions of everything that we don't have something for.
That strikes me as being a very reasonable approach to the problem.
And then the problem is you wouldn't be able to read old files, right? Because if you had something that was like, if you had a version of the library that just couldn't deal with non-checksum metadata, then everybody who had created, the defaults for forever have been to use the 1.6 file format.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all non-checksum metadata. So people just doing simple things like, hey, create a file, create a data set, like none of that would be readable by this secure library, more secure library. So
the defaults have been changed. So we're using more recent versions of the file format by default, correct?
No.
No, haven't done that yet. Okay,
No.
well.
That's an HDF5 2.0 thing.
Mhm.
So,
Okay, that's your ultimate solution.
right. So, well, and even with that, right? Like, I mean, there's still, people are still going to, there's an enormous amount of HDF5 data out there that was created
Mhm.
with the older versions. So I don't think that might be a reasonable solution for people in a high security environment. But even then, right? Like, is it really necessary? I would say it's not. That if you're just reading stuff off the disk, if we harden that layer, it does the same thing that the checksums do. It's just that it's not as easy,
Mhm.
right? I mean, because all you're doing is you're turning what used to be an assert or a seg fault or a divide by zero or something like that into a regular HDF5 library error. And it's just way easier to do with a checksum piece of metadata because the checksum's wrong. So, emit an error and say that the checksum's wrong. So that makes it really simple. It's just it's harder for like a version 1 B tree node because you have to go through and everything you parse, you have to validate. And so it's a little more challenging, but fundamentally it's the same thing. I think that all you're doing is you're making sure that the library sanely detects errors and emits a normal library error and also cleans up after itself. And that's another place where the library has historically not been very strong, is that we're very good about cleaning up resources as long as everything goes right. When everything goes right, it's like a 300,000 line CF library, like, and we don't leak memory anywhere. Like, we run F sanitized address, and so we know that, in general cases, at least what we test, we're not leaking and or losing anything, or it all works pretty well. But on errors, do we clean everything up? Sometimes not. And that's one of the things that people are starting to bring up in these fuzzer things is not necessarily like seg faults and divide by zeros, which tend to be filed as CVEs, but they tend to be memory leaks. And so I think that's what most of this last batch are, is it tends to be somebody who's just running Valgrind over this stuff and finding that we were leaking memory. The two that I looked at and fixed were both leaking memory. So that's important if you're running a long running server. So we're trying to fix all that stuff. Although those are a little trickier to clean up because sometimes the cleanup stuff is further upstream than just the simple decode function. So those will probably still show up from time to time until we get everything cleaned up. But we'll also try to make better use of the fuzzers ourselves so that we can just nip these things in the bud before and not have people report them to us. We'll just fix them ourselves. So something we're going to be working on over the summer.
Next week, we'll have John Reedy as planned to talk about cloud stuff. Great. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks for coming.
Bye all.